We are pleased to start this panel this afternoon with a very lively topic. You know, after food like that, you need a topic that maintains people awake. It's about money. So, and we have very, very good speakers for this part. This morning we spoke a lot about regulation, legal framework, and now we need to know what really matters to those who are bringing private capital to make PPP work, to make them alive, to keep them bankable, to test the bankability and accept to finance. So these are the financing providers. So I'm glad to have around me here Mrs. Agnieszka.
Yes, Agnieszka Szymczyk.
Again. Try again.
Agnieszka Szymczyk.
Agnieszka Szymczyk. And Venera Vlad.
That's easy.
Thank you. Julia Prescott and Daniel Koschik. So, I'm a lazy moderator, so what I will do, I will ask each of them before they start what they have to say to introduce themselves. And so there's a saying which says that the sugar cannot claim that it's sweet, but they will have to do it. So, more seriously, a PPP which is not bankable can be awarded and will not be financed. There was a lot of PPP of this type. So it is important for a PPP to be bankable and to be compliant with what the financiers are looking for. You have lenders and you have institutional investors. So I will start with Agnieszka to give us a perspective, what she has gone through in her experience and what exactly she would like to convey on this particular topic. Thank you.
I think I was meant to.
We don't start the presentation. We are just introducing.
You know, this is a rebellion panel because now they are all complaining here. So allow me to start again. Julia is going to start.
Okay.
And then after Julia, the two ladies here are going to talk about EBRD's perspective. And then Daniel will talk about IFC perspective. So thank you for introducing yourself and then talking about the financing. Thank you.
Mahita, thank you very much indeed, and many apologies for being such a rebellious panel. But hopefully we will get on our way. First of all, I'm Julia Prescott. I'm a co-founder of Meridiam. I have various other roles as well in UK government in particular, but I would mention in this case that I'm actually the co-chair of the Global Infrastructure Facility, the GIF, which has been extremely active in this part of the world. I'll really want to talk about financing today, though, and one of the areas that I want to talk about is bankability, financeability. Already David has given us information about Meridiam, and I won't go through that again, apart from the fact that we have actually, I want to come up with this figure, it's around, I think in this slide it's around 80 billion altogether, and that means that we have actually brought together $80 billion worth of financing. And so therefore we are very conscious of what makes a bankable project and what makes a project unable to be financed, not work, not come forward. And there are some very key elements in this. I want to go on to talk about also the fact that it can take time. And the thing about Meridiam is that Meridiam is in a position to be able to take time. We have a 25-year investment horizon. We are very much committed to the long-term success of investments. And in fact, we've never sold an asset since our inception, which makes us very patient capital. And so therefore, it means that not only do we take time to finance in the first place, do we take time to make projects bankable and financeable, but we actually continue to work with that project over time. And we have a particular focus on having long-term financing. If you look at the analysis of our funds, the majority of the funds, the debt that we raise, for example, matches the period of the concession. We don't look at refinancing as being a necessary upside in the type of investment that we do. And it's very important as well to be close to the community that we're working with. We do PPPs. We are going to be working with them over a very long period of time, the community. And so it's very important that the community feels comfortable about not only the project, but also its financeability, and feeling that what they are actually paying is a really strong investment on their side. So we see it as a balanced investment. We are making an investment, but also the community is making an investment in us actually delivering. So I want to talk a little bit more about that financeability. You've all seen this. This is classic. This is PPP as we know it. This is a structure that we all know. And I want to particularly here focus on where Meridiam comes in, which is that mid-right-hand side. Equity investors, that is the main activity of Meridiam, an equity investor. We also will organise, present, get together, negotiate with, make sure they actually sign things up, the lenders. And so therefore we have a very creative relationship with the other members of this panel in making sure that that happens. But this is a classic diagram. You've all seen it. Why is it important? It's important because it shows the discipline involved in financing. All of these relationships need to be put in place, that with the public contracting authority, with the users, with the EPC contractor, with the O&M, with the equity and the lenders. Everybody needs to be in the right place before a project is financeable. And it's very interesting that all the studies that have been done on the impact of PPP, the one of financial discipline comes out again and again as being one of the most positive aspects. What it means is the EPC contractor can't disappear off and say my contract price has doubled, although they may try. The users are conscious and they know what's being delivered over a period of time. The lenders can't go off and say we're not going to lend any longer unless this actually happens. It's the discipline of all these different parties and all these different contractual relationships remaining substantive and firm over their lives. So to get a financeable project, you need to make sure, first of all, that all these relationships work. Going on to the next area, the one thing that hasn't really been covered by the previous slide is that little box at the bottom that said users. Because what we see as one of the really key points of financeability is the strength of the revenue. So are the users paying, or is there an availability-based PPP? And this is one of the big discussions that takes place around the world about PPP, which is it going to be the taxpayer or is it going to be the individual? For example, in many regulated industries, it will be the individual. They will pay bills to their regulated utility company, but in PPP, it's mostly going to be the taxpayer. And there are a number of reasons for this. Often the taxpayer is going to be supporting a project that would not be economically financeable in any other way, that there will be gaps, that the users will actually be paying bills over a longer period of time and their focus will be regulated. But what does it do to financing? What it means is that if you put an availability type structure in, you're actually going to be covering the gap that financiers would otherwise not finance. It can also make that whole process of financing much more robust. You can have a lower cost of financing. You can often get longer periods of maturities of loans. And for example, with many of our, as I've said, many of our PPP projects, the financing actually matches the concession period, or we can get 24-year financing against a 25-year concession period. You can get a very simple approach towards the assessment by the sponsors, and that means that you can often get lower rates of return. So what you're doing is you're saying, I have a project that will be important for my society over time. I have a project that is not necessarily at this moment economically financeable, so I'm using and supporting that project by the taxpayer base. And it can often be the best economic value for the client, because otherwise the cost of your financing could be so significant that the project never goes ahead. If you have the opposite on the user-paid side, often it's very difficult to get long-term analysis that is strong enough to convince lenders that it is it's a good project for investment. So you may find that you have traffic studies that show that the actual cost of financing is going to be very tight. This leads to needing a lot of equity. The equity cost is higher. That you find that you have some risk premium because of the uncertainty. And it's sometimes impossible. And one of the things that we've noticed, for example, in the roads and highways sector, particularly across Europe, is that there has been a very great diminution of user-paid type financing because it just hasn't been possible to raise long-term financing. So you have the balance between the two. Is it going to be the taxpayer who will pay for the longer-term benefit of society, or are you going to get the users who may not be comfortable in paying the amount that you require, that you may not offer a socially acceptable tariff to pay on that side? And often we find a number of our PPP projects have been financeable because they've had availability payment type structures. I'm conscious of talking for too long here, but I think I wanted to come back to that other issues around financeability, and I put them here. Sorry, I put them up here, and they're going to be difficult to read from a distance, but they'll probably be on the presentations later. I'll just run through them quickly. Going back to that certainty, going back to the certainty that you saw in the structure, that it's very clear that you need to have dates that you can rely on, and that is going to make your project financeable. You know the construction timetable. You know that where your penalties are if anything goes wrong. You know what your financing is going to look like. The chances are you will have a fixed price construction contract, which in these inflationary days is extremely important to achieve. And so therefore you know how much finance is going to be raised. You're going to be able to have inflation risk that is going to be analysed within that construction contract. You're going to know what your annual budget is. You're not going to be potentially suffering from governments who are saying, well, I need to increase my rates for that, I need to increase my rates for that. There's also the potential of long-term optimization. When you build and you know what the future is going to look like, you can say, I'm actually going to build up front because I've also got the responsibility over the period of time for the operation and maintenance, so I can look at the balance between my construction price and my own O&M price over time. There's the rigor that I've talked about, and it's the risk balance, and that risk balance is, I'm sure, something we'll come back to. And then finally, the conditions I wanted to talk about. If you've got good planning, if the early stage project preparation has been well executed, and there's a strong and clear political commitment, then the PPP project that you're engaged with is likely to happen and likely to be financed. We've talked about pipeline earlier along. Financiers tend to, they know they're always going to be successful first time around, if only, but they know that if there is a pipeline, if they're not successful first time, they can be successful second, third time. They want to have clear timescales. They want to have advisors that they feel comfortable with, that they really feel have put a good job into the early stage work. A legal framework, I'm sure others will talk about this. They also want to know that it's, I'll come back to the community again. I think it's the community is really important in this. If community, and particularly taxpayers, are paying, they want to be comfortable with that community. And finally, it's very important to have that balanced risk approach. It's very important to feel that as you're financing, you're actually not going to be left open to huge risks that are not going to be financeable suddenly. And that appears in the legal documentation. So what I will do, I think, is come to an end there, because I think in the next session we're going to be talking more, and we're talking particularly about, I can see Günay there, who will be talking about our hospital experience in Turkey. So I'll now pass back to Mihita.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. And very quickly, something that I would like to highlight that you rightly said, which is time. Time on the side of the grantor, it's important to take the necessary time for the preparation. Time on the side of the investors, the lenders, because they also need time to assess the opportunity of investment. So it's very important. Role and discipline, that is also something very key, because if you don't identify and assign the right roles to the right people and organize the right link, once you miss one link, it can be a recipe for disaster. And at the end, something to keep in mind, PPP is about risk assessment, risk allocation, and risk determines the cost of the financing. Very important to keep in mind. I would like to invite now Agnieszka and Venera to share with us their experience.
Thank you. I was told to speak Romanian if I know Romanian, so sunt împreună cu colega mea Agnieszka, care lucrează ca și coordonator pentru proiecte de infrastructură în Polonia, iar eu coordonez proiectele de infrastructură în România și Bulgaria. Vom veni împreună cu această prezentare. Eu voi vorbi despre câteva lucruri care sunt esențiale pentru BERD ca IFI pentru a se implica într-un proiect de parteneriat public-privat, iar Agnieszka va veni cu experiența mult mai practică pe care o are din proiecte de PPP în Polonia și în alte țări din jurul Poloniei în care ea a mai fost implicată. Aș vrea să spun din capul locului că lucrez în acest sector de infrastructură, cu proiecte mari de infrastructură de prin anul 2000 și în acest context am mulți colaboratori în sectorul public și uneori sunt întrebată de ce ar finanța un proiect printr-un parteneriat public-privat versus finanțare tradițională și achiziție tradițională de lucrări și servicii. Și eu spun, în contextul românesc vorbesc, că uneori asta face diferența între a avea sau nu a avea un proiect de infrastructură și servicii esențiale pentru comunitatea respectivă. Și o spun din realitatea pe care am cunoscut-o de-a lungul anilor. Putem să dă cineva drumul la...
Julia,
Okay.
can we have a prompter?
Okay, sorry. It works like this. Așa? Ok. Acum, sigur că toți antevorbitorii mei cu siguranță au arătat de ce este important PPP-ul și de ce uneori e nevoie de o lege specială PPP. Acum vă spun din nou din experiența noastră de la BERD, este necesar pentru că nevoia de infrastructură este întotdeauna mult mai mare decât fondurile disponibile și vorbesc chiar în contextul în care România beneficiază de finanțări generoase, de granturi europene pentru proiecte de infrastructură, întotdeauna e nevoie de mult mai mult și este nevoie pentru a atrage ceea ce ne lipsește îndeopște în sectorul public. Finanțare suplimentară și experiență, management, know-how, pe care așteptăm să o atragem de la sectorul privat. Nu toate țările au o lege PPP specială, pentru că prevederile aferente unui PPP sunt incluse în Legea Generală de Achiziții Publice. În unele țări însă este nevoie de o lege PPP, cum este și în România, pentru a da un semnal, un mesaj din partea guvernului că promovarea proiectelor de parteneriat public-privat reprezintă o prioritate pentru guvern, pentru a crea un cadru instituțional care să facă propice finanțarea și implementarea proiectelor de parteneriat public-privat și pentru a acoperi anumite goluri legislative, fără de care proiectele PPP nu au cum să fie un succes. Insist însă în a spune că parteneriatul public-privat este tot o modalitate de achiziție publică. Elementul esențial este că o lege adecvată își propune să creeze un echilibru contractual între cele două părți, public și privat, știut fiind că este un parteneriat pe termen lung, mai degrabă decât o delegare de servicii pentru care dăm instrucțiuni foarte precise partenerului privat. Dacă este justificat un parteneriat public-privat și când? Este justificat atunci când vorbim de o nevoie pe termen lung pentru infrastructură și servicii publice, este justificat când detectăm acea nevoie de value for money, o valoare adăugată și mă refer în special la transferul de riscuri. Ce riscuri alocă sectorul public partenerului privat, pentru că partenerul privat le poate gestiona mai bine, în principal. Apoi este justificat în cazul proiectelor mari sau proiectelor standardizate, de tip facilități de parcare, infrastructură de parcare publică, și este justificat atunci când există voință politică. Acum, iarăși spunem noi, și aș spune eu din experiență că cel mai important lucru ca să avem proiecte PPP de succes este un mediu investițional atractiv. Și asta pleacă în primul rând de la nivelul cel mai sus, de la nivel guvernamental, prin aplicarea principiilor comerciale în sectorul pe care vrem să-l finanțăm, care este punctul de plecare pentru participarea sectorului privat, aplicarea principiului de acoperire a costurilor de investiții, de operare din tarife, evident cu suplimentare din bugetul public când este necesar. Este nevoie de o îmbunătățire a modului de urmărire a cash flow-ului și a costurilor operaționale și aici chiar avem mult de îmbunătățit în anumite sectoare. Este nevoie de o înțelegere foarte clară și o decizie a autorităților publice cu privire la activitățile pe care vor să le delege sectorului privat și este nevoie de implementarea contractelor de servicii publice conform celor mai bune practici, standardelor europene, pe care de 30 de ani încoace tot încercăm să le îmbunătățim și la noi. Este, de asemenea, un mediu investițional adecvat înseamnă acceptarea că trebuie uneori să procedem la reforme legale și de reglementare și o înțelegere foarte clară a riscurilor și rolului pe care îl au cei doi parteneri într-un parteneriat public-privat. IFI-urile în general și BERD-ul ca celelalte IFI-uri, precum IFC, Banca Mondială, cu care colaborăm astăzi, oferă asistență țărilor în care lucrează pentru a aduce acest mediu investițional la un nivel atractiv pentru investitori. Și această asistență capătă diverse forme, probabil că pe parcursul dimineții ați aflat de la colegii mei. BERD-ul ajută în general companiile de utilități să ajungă la un nivel la care pot să înțeleagă atunci când iau decizia de a merge către un parteneriat public-privat și oferim aceste programe de îmbunătățire instituțională, financiară, operațională, de management. De asemenea, oferim asistență în analiza de opțiuni cu privire la participarea sectorului privat, astfel încât autoritatea publică să decidă în cunoștință de cauză. Oferim asistență pentru consultarea publicului, a mediului de finanțare, aducem la un loc parteneri publici și privați atunci când lansăm un program de PPP și, în general, asistență pentru pregătirea proiectelor, licitare și atragerea de investitori. Este esențial și cred că s-a tot repetat pe parcursul zilei că parteneriatul public-privat este în cele din urmă despre încredere în comportamentul celor două părți pe termen lung. În general, și în România în particular, când vorbim de PPP, gândul zboară automat la privatizare și este așa o tendință de respingere. Nu privatizare, nu privatizare. Dar PPP-ul înseamnă mult mai mult de atât. Sunt foarte multe modele de parteneriat public-privat și cu diverse grade de implicare a sectorului privat și de alocare a riscurilor către sectorul privat. Și aici am arătat noi câteva modele, plecând de la delegarea contractului de servicii publice, contracte de management, proiectare și execuție, concesiunea de servicii, de operațiuni, acest model de proiectare, construcție, operare și întreținere sau proiectare, construcție, finanțare și operare și alte două modele intermediare până la privatizarea propriu-zisă. Ca atare, este nevoie de o analiză reală cu privire la ceea ce vrem ceea ce ne propunem să facem, care este obiectivul autorității publice și să aleagă dintre diversele modele care sunt disponibile. Câteva lucruri despre BERT. A fost implicat în foarte multe proiecte de parteneriat public-privat. Avem o echipă care se ocupă de pregătirea de proiecte și care se implică în acest dialog privind politicile cu sectorul public. Este prezent în toate etapele unui ciclu în toate etapele unui proiect de parteneriat public-privat. Avem experiență îndelungată cu sectorul privat și în structurarea diverselor mecanisme de finanțare pentru infrastructură. Avem capacitatea de a mobiliza finanțarea din partea diversilor investitori comerciali sau pe bază comercială sau instituțională și, iarăși foarte important, ne implicăm uneori în funcție de nevoile din diverse țări și în pregătirea de programe sau facilități și am aici două exemple pe care vreau să le arăt astăzi. Am sprijinit foarte mult programul de infrastructură spitalicească din Turcia, la care s-a referit și colega de la Meridiam, și avem o facilitate de pregătire a proiectelor în Grecia. Foarte pe scurt am să mă refer la ele. În Turcia a fost foarte important că la nivel de guvern s-au stabilit obiective foarte clare ce se dorește de la acest program de parteneriat public-privat și s-a optat pentru acest Facility Management Program, care obiectivele guvernului au fost foarte clare: să permită acces facil la servicii la standarde internaționale majorității populației, să crească eficiența operațională prin utilizarea acestei economii la scară, aducând spitale mici în campusuri spitalicești, să crească calitatea serviciilor și să crească nivelul de educație medicală și instruirea staffului medical. S-au stabilit inițial prin program 30 de spitale, acum colegul meu Alexei îmi spune că s-a ajuns la 60, pentru un buget inițial de 16 miliarde de euro. Proiectele sunt structurate pe termen lung. Inițial a fost un termen de 28 de ani, dintre care 3-4 ani perioada de construcție și 24-25 de ani perioada de operare. Finanțarea proiectului, rambursarea investiției se face pe bază de plăți de disponibilitate și plăți de servicii. Cred că s-a discutat suficient în cursul zilei de astăzi. Cert este că toate lucrările și serviciile care sunt delegate sectorului privat, cu excepția serviciului medical, serviciul public care rămâne în grija autorității publice. Cu alte cuvinte, autoritatea publică trebuie să aibă grijă doar de calitatea actului medical, în rest, totul de orice altceva se ocupă partenerul privat. Iar participarea BERD în acest program a constat în asigurarea unei finanțări pe termen lung, în angajamentul și dialogul cu Ministerul Sănătății și instituțiile subordonate, crearea unei metodologii de value for money, stabilirea unei unități de implementare a proiectului în Ministerul Sănătății și posibilitatea de replicarea acestui model cu finanțarea de către băncile comerciale ulterior. Iar în Grecia am încheiat recent un acord de colaborare pentru suport în pregătirea de proiecte. Guvernul Greciei, prin Ministerul Dezvoltării, a pus la dispoziție un buget inițial de 20 de milioane de euro pentru pregătirea aproximativ 15 proiecte. Și vor fi diverse modele de finanțare. Ideea este că se are în vedere ca finanțarea să fie din diverse surse, inclusiv din fondurile europene disponibile la nivelul Guvernului Greciei. Mă opresc aici și dau cuvântul colegei mele, care va vorbi aici câteva despre inițiativele din România, dar nu avem încă un proiect de parteneriat public-privat. Este unul pregătit până la nivel de studiu de fezabilitate. Sper că acesta să se și materializeze într-un viitor nu prea îndepărtat. Agnieszka va vorbi despre diverse în care are sens să investești prin parteneriat public-privat și câteva din... nu știu ce am făcut. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Thank you. Nu știu cum să-l livrez din nou.
Well, we lost our slides. But I was given 5 minutes to conclude. So I was initially planning to go through various sectors, what kind of structures can be applied. But since we need to fit into time given, I think the most important actually section will be the lessons learned from our projects in the PPP segment. Since we have done quite a lot, we have been doing PPPs both in the water sector, in the urban transport sector, in the district heating, in the port, airports, motorways, and facility management. So what comes as a kind of essence in the discussion of how the PPP should look like and what kind of areas should be looked at with bigger scrutiny. I think the first kind of issue is misunderstanding what public word means in the PPP structure, because when we are talking, for example, to the public authorities, especially in the less developed countries, I'm not talking about more developed countries, but in less developed countries, they often take a perspective that public means a kind of facilitator of a PPP, but not always they see it as a institution who is really in the driving seat, but also the institution who is taking the responsibility for certain risks and is responsible, for example, for payment of availability fee or some surplus which is missing in order to cover the entire fees related to the PPP. So we saw the projects in less developed countries where the public authority was saying, well, we want to do the project, but we are not going to give a penny on it during the operational phase. And this is really a wrong approach, because not always all projects can be structured that way. Of course, there might be that, for example, there is like highly desired road or highway which will be fully repayable from the tolls collected, but in the majority of cases, some form of support of a public authority will be needed. So that's kind of first lesson learned. The second one is the role of the advisors, and we saw again the projects where public authorities were trying to save money, and they were not really able to spend anything on the advisors, and this, of course, had an impact on the structure of a project. Thank you. On the structure of the project. So the role of the advisors is quite crucial in the structuring, and you shouldn't, I mean, the public authorities shouldn't save money on that. And if you want to have a project, if you want it to succeed, you need to take into account that you need to hire good lawyers, good technical advisors in order to progress with it. The next one is the size. I think it was IFC who in one of the previous panels mentioned that the size matters, and in case of small projects, most likely they will not be able to attract international competition. They will not succeed to raise financing, and most likely will not be the best value for money. There are also big projects which are simply too big, which are simply too big to being able to raise the financing from the market. So be mindful. I'm talking to the public authorities. Be mindful about the size of a project, and as we quite often see it in Poland. We hardly had, for example, any PPP done at the central level. The majority of the PPP projects are being implemented by municipalities, and this actually results in very small PPPs, like 40 million euro, for example, which are not likely to attract foreign competition or foreign investors willing to invest. We were talking today about the public champion, who will be leading the project, and this is somehow linked with the project ownership, because what we also see in the market, and this happens in the countries, for example, what kind of support, for example, is being given, for example, from the national level or from the IFI level in terms of, for example, development of a PPP structure, that public authorities are not always taking the responsibility, and they are like delaying the time when they are taking decisions, or they are not fully convinced that they want to do the project under the PPP. And this is quite visible, for example, in the countries where the EU money are available. So if you compare figure to figure, if you take into account the overall project cost, for example, procured under the classic procurement structure by the public authority and the PPP structure, PPP will always be more expensive. But when we look into value for money for the public authorities, this will not always be the case. So this project ownership, the promotion, and taking responsibility for the decisions is very important during the project structuring phase. One additional thing, risks in the project are not just a theoretical concept. It's not that public side will decide that all the risks, for example, will be transferred to the private side, and public authority will have limited responsibility in that field. It should be remembered that every risk is being with high scrutiny evaluated by the private side. If more risks are transferred to the private side, it automatically means that the project will be more expensive for the public authority ultimately. But, and not always all the risks will be controllable by the private authority. So it's better to have this balance in the risk transfers. And maybe one additional point is PPP itself is very difficult and quite complex project financing structure. And building too complex deals makes it even more difficult. So I would say try to be homogeneous in the structuring of a project and not to add additional layer of difficulty in the structuring phase. So for example, when we are talking about financing of the hospital projects, we saw quite a lot of facility management projects, but not too many of them having this component related to the clinic services. And clinic services is completely different matter comparing to the facility management skills. Don't overcomplicate it. Make it maybe first facility management and then add additional layer in the form of clinical services. The other example can be, for example, railway PPPs. Construction of the railway infrastructure is one thing, but operation of the railway services is a different matter and requires different set of skills. So from that perspective, it's also, I would say, advisable to separate PPP related to the infrastructure construction from the operation of the railway services. And maybe the last one, project output, project PPP structuring, which should be based more on the output and not on the input specification. The ultimate goal, why PPPs are with private partner, is because private partner brings efficiency, brings innovation, and can be quicker, for example, in the project implementation. And therefore, don't limit private partners during the tendering stage imposing certain input criteria, which will ultimately limit the private partner during the project structuring phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. So without further ado, I will give you, sorry? So Daniel from IFC, over to you.
So yes, let's make sure the presentation is here. Very good. So yeah, I have 5 minutes. I have 10. Thank you. I prepared for 15. But quickly, my name is Daniel Kokisch. I'm from the investment side of IFC. Not to mix up with the advisory side. So Mehita is not my boss. So when we are in action, we operate, of course, under Chinese walls. But what is interesting is when we are, as IFC, looking into the development perspective and look at markets where in the pre-feasibility stage, we want to think about PPP with the governments and make this as a recommendation. So in this case, also bankability opinions are requested from the investment side, which is highly exciting. So was the case for pre-feasibility study of Ukrainian roads, which I had the pleasure to be part of. Because many bankers only see the outcome of a PPA contract or concession agreement, but there is much more work to be done. So what I wanted to do a little bit is to go into risk assessment 101. I don't know whether it's to the good or bad that I'm the kind of last speaker in a financing panel and late in the day, but many things have been already said, and I will try to focus on filling the gaps. And also wanted to start giving us a little bit also of a numbers perspective. There is a whopping number of 3.3 trillion investment needs in infrastructure per year globally, just to keep pace with the current economic growth. And that was a number floated by McKinsey Global Institute. So that number does probably not say anything to us, but if we look into how PPPs are being used already in our region, we look into a World Bank database, and for the region, Europe and Central Asia, over the last 10 years, in PPPs of 117 billion have already taken place in low and middle income countries. What this statistics is missing is that PPP is widely used in Western European countries for setting up this, setting up public investments. So we are only really looking into markets which are just starting with the PPP volumes. And this means, nevertheless, 4 to 14 billion in annual transaction volume. And looking into the sectors, obviously the most capital-intensive sectors, airports leading with 42%, electricity 26%, and roads 24%. So overall, the transport makes up to 70% of the PPP already in the region. Looking at the geographical distribution, Turkey was mentioned. Turkey is really making heavy use of PPP. 84.5 billion over the last decade is a real big number. But also to consider here, there are some outliers, like the new Istanbul airport is already like 36 billion in size. So anyways, it's a huge number. From the Central European or Eastern European countries, Ukraine would be number 4 with 3.9 billion. And the direct neighbor of Romania, Bulgaria, at least had 1.6 billion in PPPs over the last decade. So Romania does not appear in the statistics, but we cross fingers that it will happen. Yeah, IFC, a quick overview. The infrastructure sector I'm part of for the Europe region is a global unit, and last financial year, which always goes until June, the infrastructure sector contributed 4.8 billion in new transactions to IFC's overall commitments. And the largest exposure we have is in energy, and transport makes up to 9%, but still this 9% means 500 million in new commitments for IFC. This year we have even seen a growth. We could in the first 9 months already commit 1 billion globally of which almost 70% is in PPP transactions. So you see the importance of PPP for IFC and investing into long-term projects. So now let's go a little bit into the risk assessment. We have talked about a lot about objectives of a PPP. I don't want to go into that much detail, but what really counts is the expertise of the private sector here, which the government wants to make use of, in the sense that technologically and efficiently managed projects want to be should be providing public services. But in case, for instance, airports or ports, which are brownfield assets, are being tendered for private participation as a PPP. A long-term PPP with the investments that the private investor is taking allows the government to preserve the value of the asset and even get a certain return in terms of variable concession fees back. So it's not only an investment by the government. At the same time, the private sector, apart from getting a return when managing the PPP, they have an upside, and this is very important for the later part. Sponsors may be, or investors may be, engaging higher risks than lenders would necessarily do. But we'll come to that later. And that was mentioned. I think the long-term perspective is really important also for lenders. The private sector investors in PPP, they have a long-term perspective, and that allows lenders to also provide long-term debt. So now looking at, I'm starting merging slides here, but let's look at the lenders. I mean, lenders are in the business of lending money with a return at a reasonable time frame. That was banking 50 years ago. Now there is a sustainability angle, and particularly IFC and IFIs generally. We have environmental and social standards that are part of our objective to be implemented in our investment. Also, climate change related topics are to be more and more considered into investments, which could make those investments a little more expensive. But as an example, IFC, we have committed to have 100% of our investments, and if we invest in PPP, that applies to those projects as well, being Paris aligned until 2025. So within this 1.5 degree increase maximum. And last but not least, the development impact of an IFI is important. However, if we lenders, including IFIs, invest into these projects, we are bankers, we don't have any ability to manage the project. We don't control the project, we don't control the risks. This is why it's important to have experienced investors here. But also, we are providing debt at a fixed rate, and we don't benefit from any upside. From that perspective, our core focus is really on the cash flows that are generated by the project to limit the downside risk for those cash flows, because they are in a project finance structure essential to repay the debt. So bankability actually means, from a lender's perspective, making sure that the risk is limited, because we are not willing to take this risk. There is no upside for us, and we cannot manage them. Proper risk allocation is a keyword I will probably repeat many times, which I try to avoid anyway. This structure you have seen, how project finance looks like, but just the core of this is really what you see in the center. The SPV is the one which generates the cash flows. Sponsors invest equity, and they only get dividends if the project is profitable, if they do comply with managing criteria of the asset, same as the lenders. And the core really is to protect those cash flows. This is why you have contracts with operators, with construction contractors. You try to, like in the typical project finance, contract everything to avoid leakages and control the risks. And this exactly is the reason why you are able to assess the risk and why the probability of actually a default of the financing is really reducing, which allows lenders to be very competitive in their costs of, or in their financing costs. Julia, you mentioned it. In the end, the difference in project finance compared to a sovereign lending may be not existing, or it may be even have better conditions. And just for also for the public authority here, in case of a refinancing for better conditions, in often cases in concessions, the public side would even benefit from some upsides here. No, you didn't want to say? Okay, 1 more minute. Okay, but it's not only the project which counts or which influences the analysis. It's really a lot of what was told today, the will of the politics, the stability of the economy and the framework, the long-term policies which creates trust to the investor and the lenders. Because as you really said, PPP is also an international business, and investors can be flexible to go where there are better conditions. So I will skip most of this, but I wanted to say that in terms of Romania, I see the country well placed with the statements that I heard this morning. We were already on the right path. I think the message is really important, and putting things in writing into policies and having a long-term view. With each government, it should not change the direction of private sector involvement. So, yeah, in principle, I wanted to go into a little more detailed analysis, but lenders are essentially looking at project financing like all the risks related, like construction risk, building within budget, building within time, and so on and so forth. I wanted to say that apart from this risk assessment for a project, the real important topic is the contract bankability, the concession agreement, and the various aspects also that relate to lenders. But what this risk assessment also is saying that lenders do their own risk analysis. It's not only the investor who looks at a project from its perspective, but we are also looking into our own risk assessment with own advisors. But what they need for this risk analysis is a sound and strong information basis. And this is where a well-prepared, professionally prepared PPP transactions comes into play with international reputable advisors which look into technical aspects, which look into environmental and social impacts. If investors are presented with this type of deep analysis and a very strong assessment, this is the fundamental basis for the risk assessment of lenders as well. So any shortage here will fire back. That was supposed to, I think we don't have much time. I will not go into what we require from a concession agreement, but one important aspect is termination, or is generally, I mean, actually two important aspects. Lenders are not party of the PPP agreement, of the concession agreement, so, but we, at the same time, we want to make sure that the project is going well. So this is why lenders' rights are procured in a direct agreement, which allows us, lenders, to take over a project and avoid any default. even if termination payments would be the consequence of a termination. Termination payments are good as a protection, but lenders try by all means to avoid a default because it's also complicated and a long process to get these termination payments. So this is why there is usually step-in rights where lenders can replace the investor, even if that's not good, but only in case of non-performance. And yeah, that's, like say, one of the key messages to the concession agreement. And I think we heard from Meridiam already a very good case study of Sofia Airport. I'm looking at it from the lender's perspective. IFC advised as a lead advisor. EBRD was also involved, as we know. And I think the real key from this is this was really a balanced concession agreement, which even allowed the project to succeed in the midst of the COVID times, where there was a heavy impact on the traffic numbers, which was essentially the basis for the project. So with the rebalancing mechanism, which is part of a concession agreement, if it's internationally standard, this could be avoided through some agreements to shift the cash flows, and the project finally succeeded with the investment of commercial banks, IFIs, and yeah, EBRD, IFC, EIB. I will not call them all, but also here interesting to see that the government benefited from a very high concession upfront payment, which was paid by the lenders and the investor, and it will be benefiting from annual returns depending on the revenue. So there is also a positive aspect from the government side. I will stop here. Thank you very much. I hope the message.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm very sorry to the speakers, the fact that I had to shorten your intervention. They are very interesting, and organizer, please next time give us a longer time for financiers. So thank you very much. And as you can, what we can keep in, take away from this session is that financing are available. Technical assistance is available. The only thing where we think we need, maybe at the conclusion, is commitment. We need to hear from the grantor, we need to hear from the public sector that they are committed, and they should know that all these tools, these assistance, these financings are available for PPP. The bad experience in the past is not a reason to give up on PPP, because in any case there's a need to develop infrastructure, there's a financing gap that has been mentioned. And so there's enough lesson learned also from the past that can help progress with the PPP agenda of the country. Thank you very much for your patience.